started. But feel free if like you need to get some anything. By all means. So period on the material. And that's why we gave were there any that really stood out to the group that was surprising about something that you share that was be sure. Thank you. Here. In terms of maybe, yeah, yeah. Anyone else?
Yeah, piggyback. My wife and I talked, and we loved this. It was something we could afford. Time and everything skyrocketing. So I do see the of I'm curious about the insurance rates, in regards to building. What were the series of lawsuits that led to this? Because I guess more.
Yeah. So the
if it was very widespread.
I would offer anyone city who would shed the comment or I can say knowledge watch over the decade. But if there's anyone or this like they're not for thank you. What's that? Mm-hmm. Okay. So that's something that we have to task force to our right with them to white. But what highlight what I watched her was with the almost classic loss style where you and it's or who would these men condos single family there were few next topic if there was you with structure either and the rest that pay to the and you'll smart. Well, they would come up with issues just start largely single tax. So question is it's surprising that condo has reduced so significantly and the amount of how it's how to put in the becomes if you want to build that type of product. And so people were saying like, I had no idea that this was occurring. And so I was trying to set the stage for how it started roughly 10 to 14 years ago. But please, by all means, chime in if you'd like to with your history of knowledge or yeah. And so then over time, what I started seeing happening for builders was it became so expensive to fight those litigations that either A, they just stopped building it altogether. This is just a really high level overview of what I saw during my time on one of the largest urban infill projects in the country. And then some builders, developers couldn't make it pro forma because they couldn't get the insurance coverage or it'd just be too expensive to try to overcome that potential risk of litigation.
But if there were problems in the construction of these condos that this is just
Yeah, I can, please go ahead.
I can, is it working?
Please, yeah.
Oh, I can also only speak to a very high level. The complexity of condos and townhouses are kind of notorious for having high insurance. From an architecture side, some people won't even touch it because they have to have the right insurance to even design it. And I imagine also build it because two owners who share part of the building, whether it be a wall or whatnot. Like a townhome itself, you know, you have two homeowners who share a wall. That can get tricky just because you're sharing that. And so that's also why insurance is really high. Really famous example, I think it's condos in Florida, the one that collapsed. You've got to get all of those owners to agree on a lot of improvements to the building. That can be really hard to do. And if they don't do that, bad things happen. So that was one issue.
at the condo meeting, everyone's like, we need a new roof. It's gonna cost whatever, $1 million, and everyone has to put in 10 grand. And a bunch of people are like, no, I'm not putting in the 10 grand. But then the new roof never gets done. There's
Right. And so with like an apartment complex, you know, there's one owner and they can act unilaterally to improve things. And yeah, that's one reason.
But, and ultimately what I hear Joseph asking is, but if there are issues with the construction, then why wouldn't you want to make sure those issues get resolved? And why are they only happening with that product type? And kind of dovetailing off of the architecture piece is, I think, and there's the number of people that have to get that approval to make any improvements, because you're going to have improvements over time. Like that's just inevitable. And so I think it's an easy market to go after when you have a large number of people to do that class action style suit.
I have something to
Yeah.
add, sorry.
Yeah.
Also, all of the liability goes on the developer, not on any of the subcontractors who do the work. And so the developer carries all of that risk. And also, they were going straight to litigation instead of arbitration or mediation. And so this allowed them to sue, and instead of giving the developer the right to repair or the right to remedy. And so that was a big thing. That's a big solution is they're proposing is allowing the right to remedy and giving the developer the right to fix something instead of just paying the homeowner whatever they think they deserve for it.
legislation going through this. I think a piece in Colorado too is just the statute of limitations. Like if you move into your new condo and something happens in the first couple years, that's different than, I think it's 8 years right now in Colorado, where something happens 6 or 8 years down the road and the developer's still hooked then for that long.
But to go on to like,
But most builder warranties are only 1 year. So they'll try to say like, this is it, but Colorado will carry it into 8 years now.
so right now the developer is on the hook for everything.
For 8 years.
And you're saying that it needs to be pushed on to the contractors, subcontractors. But then would that shift the insurance from the developer to the contractors? And then it'd be same price wise? That's the other side of it, is the insurance.
That goes for all property types, not just
Right.
condos,
Right.
especially in
Right.
the last 12 months.
Right. Chelsea?
I'll just speak to this briefly because I know we probably want to move on. But when I was working at the state legislature, I worked on construction defects for several sessions in a row. And what you're getting at, Joe, is the political complexity of this issue. So it's not cut and dry. And what's interesting is that there is very intense bipartisan support to solve this problem. And there's also very significant, very well-funded lobby interests on both sides to not solve this issue. And so, yes, we want consumer protection in this country. We have consumer protection laws. Jumping to a lawsuit, most people agree, is not the most useful way to approach a consumer protection challenge. And so what are the other statute options we can put into place, like right to repair or statute of limitations, to ensure that homeowners actually do have protections, but not to such a degree that it disincentivizes any for sale housing development, which is what we're seeing now. And so several years ago, when this legislation went into effect, builders just said, well, it's not worth the risk. All of building is about balancing risk and financing, right? And they said, well, we'll just build apartments because why would we open ourselves up to these class action lawsuits of all of these homeowners? And that's why we have a ton of big luxury apartments and not for sale units. It's one of the biggest reasons why we're in the challenge we're in across the entire metro. And every time we tried to solve it, I probably worked on it 6 years in a row with my boss, it would get killed by the trial lawyers because they don't necessarily get paid the same amount if they go to mediation instead of going to trial. And so there's just all of these other dynamics that make it deeply difficult. We did get mediation, I think, in 2017, but there's a long way to go still to actually solve it, which is the complexity.
Okay. Well, we're going to jump ahead. That was a really good discussion, though. I want us to be able to get to our midpoint reflection before we go to our housing codes presentation. And for the midpoint check reflection, I just want you all to think about all that we've talked about to this point. And so what we provided you with are some notes that were recapping, just synthesizing everything we've talked about. And so, you know what happened since December, right? Like we created some group expectations of how we're going to work together. And then we got some introduction. We entered into that education phase that we're still in. So affordable housing policies, trying to figure out our strategic vision framing, got an overview of root policy, Prop 123, and learning how other cities approach affordable housing in May and finalizing that March rather, and finalizing that strategic vision. And then last month, we got an intro to land banking. And so what I want us to be able to do today, and remember, like this was the strategic vision that's guiding you and how you're going to continue to inform your recommendations. And so what I want you to think about is how can you report out, and I want you just to get into groups again, but I want you to think about some identified themes that might help shape future priorities recommendations. So just what's coming to the top for you at this midpoint based on what we've learned over these past 5 sessions, okay? So I'm gonna give you about 10 minutes just to have that conversation. And I just need you to pick a scribe who will help capture what you're thinking. And then we'll go into the presentation, okay? Any questions about what we're gonna do next? Okay, doing groups of a lot of people today. So we're gonna do groups of 4. So 4. We'll do, Brad, do you wanna be part? No, okay. Group, do you wanna? Okay, great. If you will work with Samantha and Amber, and actually we'll keep you three together. And then Samantha, can you come be with Jake and Kevin? Give this to you. And then Jake, I'm going to give this to you. Yeah. And if you could just spend, again, 10 minutes just thinking about what are some themes that you feel have come up like high level that would inform your recommendations. You don't have to know, you don't have to finalize them as your recommendations, but what do you want to begin thinking about as your priorities, okay? Okay, go for it.
Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Brian Isom. I'm the planning manager with the city of Inglewood. I've been with the city here for about 2 years. I've been a planner for closer to 9. I started as an intern in the city of Arlington, Texas. I worked there for about 4.5 years. Then I moved to be the director for the city of Lubbock in West Texas. And then I moved out here again about 2 years ago. I have degrees in landscape architecture and city and regional planning, so I kind of have a dual background, I guess, which I think makes me a little bit. I like plants, but I also like people, so it's kind of a fun background for me. So for Code Next, I think the first thing that we changed, at least from a development perspective, is we changed our terminology in the city. Our previous Title 16 really only talked about 2 types of housing, either 1-unit detached dwellings or multi-unit dwellings. So 1-unit detached dwelling, think about a single family detached home. Multi-unit dwelling could have been anything from a townhouse, a duplex, a triplex, a quadplex, to an apartment complex. It really just bundled everything into one. So part of change code now was to try to really hone in on those different housing types. You know, a detached house is still your single family detached dwelling, but we categorize, you know, multi-unit dwellings into 3 different sections. A multi-unit house, so that's 1 to 4 units. Or 2 to 4 units. So think about duplex, triplex, quadplex. An attached house, so that's more along the line of a row home or townhouse. So those would be subdivided. So each one is its own single family home. In a lot of planning circles, they're called single family attached housing. But just for all intents and purposes here, we're going to kind of lump it in this category. And then apartments and mixed use. So if you think of anything 5 units and above, that's what falls into this category. So again, just a little bit more descriptions on each one. Attached housing is anything from 2 units and up. It's generally limited by how much area the fire truck can reach around it and the fire department can reach around it, because they have to be able to fight their fires. So there's less of a limiting factor on our end, although we do cap ours in some areas. And then multi-unit houses, part of what we did in this change was trying to get them to look a lot more like our single family homes. You'll see this in a lot of the new residential design standards. What we heard from the community was these new projects stick out like a sore thumb. You know, it looks nothing like what we have currently. So some of our design standards were upgraded, or actually all of our design standards in the residential sector were upgraded to try to get new development to look a little bit more similar to what's here, try to make it assimilate into our neighborhoods. Other terminology that we changed was our our standard lots. So the previous code generally had what was considered a standard lot for each zoning district, so your residential districts. Then you also had what was called a small lot and an urban lot. These lots had to exist in 2004 when the code was adopted. And in order to get developed on, they had smaller lot sizes than what would typically be allowed. But in order for them to be developed on from an administrative standpoint, there had to be a home on there at that time in 2004. So if you think about some of these small lots that are tucked in to some of your developments across the city, if there was a house on there in 2004 and it was like a 4,000 to 5,000 square foot lot, there was an opportunity to redevelop it through an administrative route. If there was no home and it was vacant, it had to go to a public hearing, which from a development standpoint slows things down, and people are less likely to come in and try to redevelop things like that. So what our new code did, sorry, I thought I switched to this. We created a few new lot standards or new lot types. The first one is called the front and rear corner lot. The thought behind this was to allow corner lots in the R1 district, so R1A, B, and C, to be able to subdivide the rear third, approximately, of their lot to build a small home. You have a choice. If you're on a corner lot, you could either do, you know, this small detached home that's subdivided separately, it can be sold separately, or you could build an accessory dwelling unit on that rear portion of your lot. You end up with the same amount of dwelling units, but again, one can be sold separately, so that's a different option. In grain lot, for our configurations and our code, it's generally only used for townhomes. What it generally means is that the entire project now faces the street opposite of where the primary units normally face. So if all your homes generally face to the south, and then you have a new corner lot project that comes in and they face to the west, that's what we consider the in grain projects. And then courtyard lots, they're internal to your block face, so they're not permitted on your corner lots in the R1 district. So R1, A, B, and C, they're only allowed to be internal. They're required to have a courtyard internal to the project where all the homes face along that courtyard. It generally has to be 25-foot wide and 1,500 square foot total. And it can be bigger, but that's the minimum. The other term I want everybody to think about as we go through this presentation is incremental. The changes that we made to the code were not giant sweeping changes. They're very small changes that can help to increase our level of density within our city. And I'll kind of show you what we look at when we do these things. But they're very small and they're very minor changes. So I want you to keep thinking of that word incremental. So another thing that our department does is historic preservation. So these maps are part of a historic preservation presentation that was given by a group called Pinion that looked at the development throughout the city. But I think it's kind of apt to give this presentation to you all so you can understand what makes our job even more complicated, especially in a city like Inglewood, where we're really not growing out anymore. Generally, when people are rewriting zoning codes, they're focusing a lot on all the vacant land that they've annexed and they haven't developed yet and trying to make sure it grows in these steady orders. Our focus was to look at a city that's completely built out, and now how do we accommodate additional dwelling types and additional development? So if you look, this is the development. Each one of these colors will represent a different decade of development with the city of Inglewood. So in 1900, it was very small. The city of Inglewood incorporated in 1903. But in the 1910s, you start to see a little bit more. The 20s, 30s. And this is the first decade that we had zoning in the city. So anything prior to 1940 was developed without zoning in place. So a lot of our city had already occurred before the first zoning ordinances were starting to become put in place in the city. Then after that, generally, you would start to see our zoning code starts to get updated about every 10 to 15 years. The map stops in the 1970s because from a Historic Preservation Commission standpoint, buildings have to be 50 years old at least before they start becoming historic. So I'm almost historic, maybe 9 more years, 8 more years if my math is right. But now you can also see what we changed from in 2004 was from a zoning code to what's called a Unified Development Code. Unified Development Codes actually just combine subdivision regulations and zoning codes. So the zoning code tells you what you can do, where you can do it. Subdivision regulations tell you how you can get there. So it tells you, what your water and sewer have to look like, what the streets have to look like when you build them, how wide they have to be, how you can dedicate easements, things like that. I think for me, this map is also pretty telling. So this is that map or that aerial from the 1930s again. The map on the left is from a council request that we did last year that shows the number of non-conforming properties across the city. So this would be like if somebody had a duplex that was built in the early 1900s and then it was zoned in the 1940s as single family. Well, it's allowed to exist unless it gets demolished or there's some kind of natural disaster or fire that knocks it down past a certain point of demolition, then it has to be raised and has to come back as conforming. But this can show that, there's over 104 non-conforming registered accessory dwelling units throughout the city. There's over almost 100 non-conforming multi-unit developments. So anything 2 units and above on most likely R1A property. So R1A, B, or C property. or in some cases in commercial areas. In the last part of our background, we started to put this stuff together with our consultants and looking at the number of lots. I think the number of lots at this point was put together for some presentations for one of our council study sessions. I thought it was pretty apt to show you how completely dispersed and how small of an amount ADUs really are in our city. 0.399% of R1A lots have an ADU. So less than 1%. No R1B lots have a non-conforming or brand new ADU. R1C, we're just under 1.5%. R2A, we're just over 1%, and R2B is the highest percentage at 2.25%. So I know during the Code Next process, we heard a lot about this inundation of ADUs. It's just not there. We don't have as many ADUs as people think. I do know that there probably are people renting out extra bedrooms and things like that, but those don't qualify as an ADU. And even since 2019, when accessory dwelling unit allowances were first approved, we're still at very, very small levels. So all these numbers at the bottom are the development review team meetings that have occurred only up to the Code Next adoption. So to build an accessory dwelling unit, there's 3 steps in our code. The first thing you have to do is a development review team meeting, which means you meet with city staff to determine, am I allowed to do this? You know, what kind of things do I need to do to make this work? You know, from utility standpoint, fire marshal, building division, planning division, public works, all those teams meet together with them. The second step is what's called a use permit. So this is where prior code cycle would have required you to submit your primary residency stuff, your deed restrictions for your property. All those requirements were removed. And now it mainly triggers your property maintenance inspection. So an ADU to get built, your property has to be inspected to make sure it's up to certain standards. If it's not, you just have to rectify those issues and then you can move forward to the building permit phase. And so, you know, that this is only through R1A and R2B. The MUR districts, I don't have the numbers for a lot, so I couldn't include them in this presentation. But I did want to point out that even in an R1C district, there's one ADU for about every 3 blocks, every 3 city blocks. So I know that some of the reading and some of the things that we talk about as planners try to get us to steer away from talking in dwelling units per acre. Just as it's kind of an old terminology. There's a push to kind of everybody stop talking about that and just focus on housing types. I think it's important to understand where we're at as a city now, and when we look at these districts and what these changes can look like overall from a density perspective. So each one of these gives kind of some typicals for R1A, R1B, and R1C blocks. So typically in an R1A block, you'll see 8 houses per side of the street, or 8 houses per side of the block, based on the 9,000 square foot to 10,000, the 9,000 square foot minimum lot requirement, but most of them are a little bit above that. So generally you're somewhere around 8 per side, so 16 homes per block. R1B gets up to 20 and R1C to 24. So for each one of those districts, that comes out to about 4.3 dwelling units per acre for R1A, 5.46 for R1B, and 6.5 for R1C. So when we work with our consultants on trying to accommodate these additional levels of density within our city, the best thing for us to do was to go back and look at what's already been built in our city. So we start going and looking at some of those non-conforming areas and saying, well, what's going on here? What happened here? Is it working? And how can we make it do that again? How can we duplicate this? So what you'll see in these pictures at the bottom are three different ideas. One was an accessory dwelling unit, generally located at the rear of the lot. We already had some standards. for certain districts, but looking at expanding it through all of them. The middle pictures are actually of lots that have been subdivided where there is a rear unit at the back. They've been completely subdivided. So there's two different ownerships. Sometimes it's the same ownership and somebody rents it out. Then the third one, this is the only project like this in Inglewood, but it is and used around the Denver area. But the idea of this courtyard development where you have a courtyard in the middle where it's under common ownership, and then you have ownership of separate units that front the courtyard that use that space kind of as their own front yard. So the consultants and staff work together to try to come up with what this could look like. So that's where we came up with the standards that you'll see here in a minute that look at like the rear third for front and corner lots, or these other lot sizes for courtyard patterns, and trying to kind of assimilate these back into our standards, and to make sure that we include lot dimension standards that make them fit into the neighborhoods. So just these small standards, if you were to put one house on a rear corner lot on a block, where it would essentially have 3 lots combined, and this is in an R1C district, 3 lots combined to do a courtyard pattern with, I believe that's 6 homes, and then 1 ADU. Just before the ADU, you could increase your density from 6.5 dwelling units per acre to 7.6 dwelling units per acre. If you add in the ADU, it gets to a total of 7.91 dwelling units per acre. So we're able to increase density with these minor changes that to the naked eye wouldn't even notice that they're there, minus the courtyard, because that one does look a little bit different. But these are just incremental changes that we've made throughout the code to try to help push these additional levels of density. Does anybody have any questions up to now? Yes, sir.
This is not, a lot of times you see density in terms of people per square mile. This is just, you're talking about just the land that's zoned residential. Are streets included in this, or is this just?
So for these what I calculated it on was just the block,
That's
just the
like
land
that
area of the
residential
block,
acre?
not like the entire R1C district.
Okay,
That would take some additional work on our end, some GIS folks.
no,
but
I think
yeah.
this is more helpful because I don't know why you would include the streets in calculating density since nobody was on those.
Well,
some
and
people do.
most cities will do
Sadly.
that. They'll put a density cap on a district at like, for single family, one of the cities I worked in was like 7.2 dwelling units per acre. But the reality is you'll never get there because you're having to factor in your streets and all these other things that don't really count towards that density level. So
I'll just add quickly, on Brian's behalf, since we're on the record and sometimes it gets confusing. When he says, when we're trying to increase the density, it's because that was the direction of city council. It's not that staff is coming to city council and saying we need to increase the density. It's based on the surveys and the feedback that we got from the citizens around how can we do this and keep it cohesive in the way that it feels. So sometimes it gets confusing, and I just want to make it very clear that that's staff responding to council direction on this project.
thank you for saying that. Sorry.
I have a question on, you mentioned that 2% and less of the allowed homes have ADUs. How much density does this allow for, and what, if this were to happen in all of these districts, do you know how much potential there is in this rezoning?
No, I didn't calculate how much if every single lot redeveloped or something like that. I mean, if y'all want those numbers, we're happy to calculate them, but
I'm just curious if your rezoning efforts are going to meet the need of the city, is really in the needs of the housing gap.
sure. First off, there was no rezoning. I want to make sure nobody's using that term. There was absolutely no rezoning that went along with this code project.
Changing the terms of the zone.
Yes. So I don't think, and this is from a professional perspective of mine, this will not meet the gap that we need. This is one brick and a whole wall of bricks. If some of the readings that we sent out talk about all the different things that you have to do, this is part of it. And this is the part that really focuses on trying to capture that NOAA, that naturally occurring affordable housing. Because for the majority of what we did with our code, there are no affordable ties to it. There is one portion that has that, and it's mainly just a placeholder for you guys to do your portion of this to figure out how we get there. But the majority of this is just trying to get that naturally affordable, smaller unit development that we've been missing. You know, in our code previously, I think up until 85, our city actually required a minimum square footage for a house, which now is seen as a terrible thing to do because you're trying to get smaller homes. We're trying to get, you know, family sizes are changing. They're not as big as they used to be. So you're trying to get a smaller home in some sides. Some sides people are getting bigger homes and they're using them to rent. I mean, but you know, the city required, I think it was an 1,100 square foot minimum home in an R1A district. But those were removed at one point and pushed forward. Anybody else? Or are we good to keep going? Oh, sorry. And that's what it could look like. So very small changes. And this is if everything happened on one block. Like I said, we did the numbers on the ADUs, and in an R1C district, there's one ADU for every 3 blocks. We've had, I think, 3 development review team meetings for front and corner subdivisions. So not a lot. We've had 1, maybe 2 development review team meetings for courtyard pattern homes in the last 6 months. So they're not, you know, these things that are coming in by the droves. They're very small changes that can occur. So this is what our development code looked like for the R1A districts prior to Code Next adoption. The majority of our R1, actually the majority of our codes are set up based on how the city was subdivided originally. If you ever looked at City of Inglewood, old zoning or old plat documents, the city was kind of subdivided. Each lot was each block was subdivided into smaller 25-foot lots. And then the early half of the 1900s, what would happen is when they were coming to sell it, you didn't just buy one lot. You could, but most of the time you bought one lot plus a half of the next lot, one lot plus the next lot, or 3 lots or 4 lots. And it was a very common thing to do at that time. The cities I work for in Texas, they did the same thing. They were subdivided into 25-foot increments and they just sold it that way. Or they deeded it out into a lot and a half, a lot and 3/4, a lot and a third, and that's how they were sold. So Inglewood zoning code was really tailored towards those existing lots. So that's where you'll see a lot of our code changes, and some of the previous code talk about 37.5-foot lots or 37-foot lots. It's a weird number. Let me tell you, from a planning perspective, that's a really random number, but it's really based on how our city has grown. It's not something that we just pulled out of the air. It's something that we work with our consultants and our staff. We have staff members that have been here for over 20 years that have talked about the development in the city and how these codes have been adopted and why. And that's where we focused on looking back at how things had done and trying to fix them or trying to work with them and where we're going. So some of our bigger changes that we made for the R1A districts or R1 districts, we remained detached housing as a primary housing type, created opportunities for what we call the small lot detached housing. So those new situations. So front and rear corner lots only allowed on corner lots. Courtyard pattern homes only allowed in the middle of your block. And then we expanded accessory dwelling units into the R1A and R1B districts. So previously they were only allowed in R1C in the R1 districts, but now they're allowed in R1A, B, and C. And these are just we've put together some handouts so that people can better understand some of these changes. And these are some of the graphics that we had put together just to kind of show what could be done in an R1A district or what kind of housing types you might be able to see if you're there. So again, detached homes are the primary housing type. And you can see that progression and density just from our existing zoning and the smaller lots that are allowed in R1C versus R1B versus R1A. But these include just some illustrations of courtyard patterns and then rear and front lot configurations. Sure. Most of them what now? The alleys are drawn in these illustrations. They're very faint, but they're drawn in there. And the only thing that changes on the alley, at least from a planning perspective, the majority of it is how wide your driveway and your garage can be. So there's benefits to having a rear loaded garage, or there's more, the most benefits come for rear loaded garages. Second most benefit would come from having a driveway that goes down past the side of your house and you have a garage that's pushed towards the back, versus the least benefit would having one just attached to the front of your house. It's not saying that it's illegal. It's just saying you get more benefits if you push your garage further back rather than having it attached to the front. So our R2 districts, again, detached homes are the primary housing type. I mean, they are generally are considered the primary housing type. We are seeing an influx, at least prior to Code Next, of areas where you're seeing a lot more duplex, triplex, and quadplex development. Those were areas that have been historically zoned to allow for that development. This is another thing that's occurred quite regularly across the country, where if a single family home was allowed and the zoning was in place for duplexes, a lot of times you saw more single family homes than duplexes. It just wasn't a product that was built as much when properties were developed, years ago. Now it's a lot more readily developed, but it wasn't always. So in both cities that I worked at before I moved here, we had the same issue where you had a bunch of single family homes. Someone found out that duplexes were allowed there. They started to build one, more people found out, and you started to see more and more get built. It's just it's kind of a natural phenomenon that happens in areas like that. In the R2 districts prior to Code Next, again, ADUs were allowed. We had some multi-unit dwellings that were allowed. R2A allowed for 2. There was no maximum on our R2B. Some of the issues that I think came along with these developments was there's what's called a per unit minimum lot size, which means to build a duplex, you have to have 6,000 square feet minimum. But to build the bigger projects, if you wanted to build like a 5-unit development, it had 15,000 square feet. That was required in our code. So the code was pushing these developments to get bigger and bigger just because of our requirements. So the Code Next project looked at adjusting these requirements. So this is where you'll see the difference between our attached house product, so that's your townhome product, versus multi-unit, which is duplex, triplex, quadplex. And it altered some of our minimum or per unit minimum lot size requirements to try to get smaller built projects. So if you're thinking about, a 5, 6, or 7 unit apartment complex, instead of requiring 3,000 square foot of lot area per unit, it now would require 1,200 square foot of lot area per unit. So it's trying to push some of that development down. One of the other things that came out of this that we felt was a pretty novel idea was an aim to try to preserve some of the existing single family detached housing in some of these districts. What we've seen occurring is that these homes are being torn down to build 2, 3, and 4 unit projects. So the idea was to allow ADUs to kind of help preserve those single family detached by allowing someone to build up to 3 ADUs to get to that same level of density, so 4 units. But now keeping the existing home, building 1 detached and 1 or 2 attached products to try to get additional levels of density while preserving the housing that we already have. Does anybody have any questions on this one? So some of the project types that you might be able to see are illustrated here. So anything from detached homes to on R2A districts, on corner lots, you can see this additional incremental change. So previously we only allowed up to 2 units in R2A. Now on corner lots, you could do up to 4 units. And then in R2B, or you could do 6 attached house, so 6 townhomes or a quadplex, basically. In R2B, your general housing types, detached homes all the way up to 4-unit, multi-unit homes or a 6-unit townhouse project, or on corner lots, you can allow up to an 8-unit apartment building. So where it was limited to 4, now on corners, you can get that small bump to allow additional density. And the last of our residential districts are the MU3 districts. These are more of our more dense districts, more apartment heavy districts, and geared a little bit more mixed use. But again, you have these very large per unit minimum lot size requirements that drive these project sizes up and that don't make them really feasible. But it also makes acquiring all that land to build something really difficult. So to buy all the land, 3 or 4 lots in a row, everybody has to be willing to sell, makes it really difficult to build projects like this. So what Code Next did was really reduce some of those minimum lot size requirements, but in areas where there were no maximum number of units, so you're less dense, so the density level goes from low to high, from left to right. So in the MUR3A district, it only allows up to 8 units per project. In the MUR3B, we're up to 16, and MUR3C, which is our most dense residential districts, that's where you have no cap on the number of units. You're just more limited by the amount of land, plus your parking, things of that nature. Again, we really tried to, in this area, this is where we limited or we shrunk the minimum lot size for single family homes. So I think before it was 6,000 square feet. Now we're still trying to push for single family homes, but in smaller varieties. So these are minimum lot sizes of 3,000 square foot. Attached products, I think the lot size goes down again to 1,500 square foot for townhomes. And then on multi-unit houses, instead of just having the minimum, we actually put a cap on them so that we're not getting these very large, if you're building something that's got 15,000 square foot, you can make a pretty massive project. We're limiting those in size from 6,000 to 10,000 square foot. So we're putting a cap on those because it's really aiming for these smaller style projects. And again, ADUs can have anywhere from 1 to 3 for detached products. But in all of this, ADUs, another shift that was made with ADUs are now allowed for multi-unit homes. They can get up to 1. Townhomes actually have allowances for ADUs now, which didn't have before. So there's a bigger push to allow for more ADUs in those as well. And unfortunately, I don't have a fancy graphic for that because I do all those. And I just have not had a chance to make those for the MUR districts. Does anybody have any questions on those? Okay. So the last few slides will just kind of touch on a few more overarching themes that we talked about through the last few slides. Originally, accessory dwelling units were only allowed in R1A, R1C, the R2 districts, and some of the MUR districts. Code Next really pushed the envelope to allow ADUs across the city in all your residential districts. Code Next process also removed owner occupancy requirements and parking requirements for all ADUs. And again, there's some pushes or there's some allowances for attached homes and multi-unit houses, which weren't there before. And then there's allowances for up to 3 ADUs along with detached homes in the R2B and MUR3 districts. So a real big push to allow for more ADUs across the city. There are design standards that have been included. We also, the code also increased the size limit up to 800 square foot for attached or detached units and attached units. A basement unit actually gets the same square footage as the first floor or the footprint of the home. We have a lot of basements in Eaglewood. People have asked for years to be able to convert those, but we didn't have a way to get there yet, and we do now. And then if you did, attached to 800 square foot, Parking limits were removed. They do follow the same design and development standards as the detached house. Mainly from a design perspective, what we're trying to accommodate or we're trying to do is to keep their entrances subordinate to the main entrance to the main house. So your main house entrance is at the front door on the front facade of your home. The ADU has to be back behind there, back behind your house with an entrance either through your yard or from the alley. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Are there now, or were there previously requirements, like if you wanted to build an ADU, even like a detached ADU, that you had to bring the rest of the house up to modern building code? Or
Bring it up to what now?
like modern building code?
So that's always been a misconception in this city. So it was never to bring the entire house up to modern building codes. What was required is to bring the home, the primary home, up to property maintenance standards. So if there is a deficiency, yes, you have to increase it. Does it mean that they're going to make you rewire your entire house to 2021 standards? No, unless there's an issue. So as long as you're meeting and we can send out the list, our inspectors, our building folks, anytime there's a DRT for an ADU, that's the first thing that gets sent out is the property maintenance code list of things that they go inspect. Make sure you have screens on windows. That's the one that always sticks in my head. But that's what has to be met. And that was not changed. But we are trying to make sure that that misconception does not continue. I think we talked at length to council about it because that was a question I know that one of them raised was they felt like that was deterring people from doing it. The reality is it might be, but not because that's what we required, but just because that's what people thought.
We did, to add to that, we did change the wording on that because it did sound in the, you could.
Yes.
Definitely a possible interpretation that you had to bring it all the way up to building code, but that was not the original intention. And now it explicitly says property maintenance code.
Is that something we can just get anyway? Like, is that online somewhere, that property maintenance list?
Like the document that
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah. I don't know if their checklist is online that you have to meet. I know if you reach out to them, they'll give it to you, but we can check, and it probably would be a good thing to have on our website, at least on our ADU page for people to ask or people that are looking into it.
yeah,
So,
either for this group or,
yeah, and we can definitely get it to the group. And part of those images that I put out on the R1, A, B, and C, they're part of what we call like user guides that we're putting out with our new code to help people better understand what's allowed. So we have one on fences. We have one that talks about your zoning building envelope and how we calculate it and what it looks like. We have another one that we just finished about home occupations that talks about what kind of businesses you can run from your home. Accessory dwelling units one is one we've been working on. We don't have it out yet. I know a few more that we're working on, but that's definitely a good one that we should push out.
Yeah, I'll arrange to get the property maintenance code list so that you guys can
Yep.
take a look. Yeah, great question.
So small lot detached housing, this is most of the regulations from this were pulled straight from our our previous small lot and urban lot allowances. So the lot size, the only thing that we really changed was our configuration. So instead of having to be a lot that existed 20 years ago, we're now allowing these things to be created new, but only in certain configurations and only in certain areas. One of the things that did occur is they reduced the height of the building on those scenarios from 32 feet to 25 feet. Again, this is a push to get a smaller product. So we're trying to squish that building envelope down a little bit. And then courtyard patterns have additional design standards. So they have to keep that courtyard green. They have to plant trees. Their access generally would come from the rear or from shared access. So you're not having 6 driveways come across one lot. And then we reduced the overall minimum lot size requirement for detached homes in the R2 and MUR3 districts from 6,000 square foot to 3,000 square foot. And the last thing our code worked on was our multi-unit projects. Again, the biggest things here were putting the size limits on projects in the MUR districts to really try to right-size those projects for those districts. But the biggest one that I think occurred was just the change in our parking regulations. Part of the conversation was to make, projects more affordable. Parking is probably one of the biggest drivers in cost in these projects. I think I've got some numbers I put together from, oh yeah. So there was a study done in 2022. I think the city of Golden was looking at some of the housing stuff. The approximate cost for one parking space in a parking garage is about $28,000 to build one spot. And I'm sure it's probably gone up a couple times since then. So what our code did was it right-sized our parking requirements. So for a 1 to 2 unit apartment, previously, you would have to provide 1.5 parking spaces, or 1 to 2 unit apartment was 1.5 parking spaces. For anything 3 units and above, you had to provide 2. And overall, you had to provide 1 parking space for every 5 apartments for guests. So on average, for an apartment complex for 1-bedroom units, say for 100 of them, you'd have to provide 1.7 spaces per unit. So that's about 170 spaces. Our new code, what it did was looked at each unit separately. So 1-bedroom units and efficiencies only provide one space. 2 bedrooms are 1.5, 3 bedrooms and above are 2. So that same apartment complex with 100 1-bedroom units is now only building 120 spaces instead of 170. So you're trying to cut that in half, which could save them about $1.4 million once you factor in the cost of a parking garage space. The last thing, and I touched on this kind of briefly, was we put some affordable housing incentives in our code, but it's really waiting for this group to figure out how we can track it, where that information goes. So it's mainly a placeholder, but that allows for even more reductions, especially if you're adjacent to transit. So if you're adjacent to one of the light rail stations, you can get more parking reductions, or you can get an increase in your height, allowing additional units. And then it's all tiered based on the level of affordability that you provide. Oh, sorry. The last thing we did, which now doesn't have as much teeth as it did, was the council directed us to look at increasing the occupancy limitations within the city. So prior to Code Next, you were limited to no more than 2 unrelated people per home. Code Next adoption brought it up to 4. And then within the last few weeks, the state has signed in a law that says that we can't do that anymore. We now have to base it on something like our property maintenance code, which really is looking at just the number of people per square foot of different occupancy types. So it'll be a little bit more complicated, but it would generally increase the number of people allowed in a dwelling unit. But I think that's what makes this group's direction and job very important, because at least from a planner standpoint, a local planner standpoint, if we don't fix these things in our city now, the state will. And it's going to be the same across the board. They're going to lump us in with cities out west, out east, with Denver, bigger cities, smaller cities, and it's generally going to be a very one-size-fits-all approach. So that's my spiel and why I think y'all's job is great and very important. And if you have any questions for me on this part? Yeah.
Look at ADUs. Do you know how that squares with what we've done in Code Next?
Just from our own look at it, it's very close to what we did. I think there's some tracking measures that we have to do but we've already worked on a tracking system internally to keep track of what we've got going on. But I know it's really closely aligned with what was approved with close code.
There was
next.
even some design standards, I think, in that bill that I wasn't sure, you know, with the setbacks and the bulk plane and if there was confliction at all.
No, and I haven't gone through to see if anything has changed recently, but I know from my first reading through it, it very closely aligns with what we already allow.
In regards to the height restrictions from 32 to 25, does that make it so you can't do second story or second floors on these units?
So those were only for the small lots. The regular standard lot is actually dropped from 32 to 30 feet. I think the push is to try to make those rear lots still subordinate, so you're not stacking these very large 2 to 3 story homes. I think you probably still get a second story. Most likely you might see more split levels where you have your basement a few feet above ground, and you're thinking more of a stoop rather than a one-step front porch. We haven't seen, like I said, we haven't seen any of these come in yet, or at least not for building permit. So once we do, I think we'll know more of what we can anticipate. But we do have some projects that are kind of making their way through our process right now.
When that change was made, it technically still feasible to do over a garage, right? A ADU on top of a garage in the back, like with that limitation.
Yeah, we actually have one working its way through the process right now too, as an ADU above a garage.
Can you add to an existing structure in Inglewood, an ADU on top of an existing garage?
You can. There's a lot more challenges with our building code. And this is, I don't necessarily want to touch on it because I know just enough to be dangerous of it, but you have a lot more issues with how the garage was built, how the foundations were built and what it was built for, being kind of some limiting factors on that. It is possible. It's just very difficult.
The sort of placeholders for affordability in Code Next, you talked about parking reductions and additional height. Are those the only two sort of levers there?
Those were the only two that were included in our code. Because we don't necessarily have a base density or a maximum density in our districts. Like I said, some cities will tell you, you can develop up to 22 dwelling units per acre or 12 dwelling units per acre. Since we don't follow a strict density requirement, I think the height bonus was more beneficial than doing anything like that.
I'll just add to that and say that we looked at a lot of different affordability options, and some might remember one of the ones we were looking at is, would we allow multifamily development up to 4 units in a single family area if they were deed restricted for affordable? But it's really hard to make the math work. And when we took that off the table, the same night we said, but we want to set up this task force to really see, like, what is the right solution? How can we make the math and the funding work? Maybe it's that, maybe it's something else. Maybe it's the larger multifamily pieces where it's already zoned that way. But looking at, are there maybe exceptions to some of the way that the code is now that you all would be interested in looking at to build in the affordability requirements or the bonuses, which is a big reason why we want your input.
Yeah, I guess just to build on that point, there was some robust conversation about the appropriateness of affordability in the zoning code. It's more of a policy piece that should exist outside or parallel to, and I think that's where some of that went as well.
I might be really off base here, but wouldn't some of these ADU units, just by virtue of their size, be more affordable without any sort of mandate or anything?
So that's this piece. The Code Next piece has no money tied to it that can help anybody. There's no monetary incentive for anybody building them. It's just actually just allowing it to occur. So yeah, they're by definition, they're smaller. Their goal is to be much more affordable. So yeah, that's why this was so important to get achieved. I mean, if you go back, I know a lot of y'all's work revolves around root policies work. If you go back to action item number 3, update zoning code to reduce barriers for more diverse housing types. I think this code update checked every single one of those boxes by allowing just different types of housing that we didn't allow before. Prior to, I mean, it was very strict. You build single family homes, that's pretty much it. In your R2 districts, you can build duplexes and triplexes and quadplexes. This just allows more diverse housing types to occur throughout our city. And it's only from a naturally occurring standpoint of affordability. So there's no monetary incentives tied to this code. That's again where y'all's group gets to come in and look at incentives that might create, or the state. I think one of the state bill has some incentives based in there. I think they had some talk about some incentives towards ADUs, but from a city standpoint, we don't have any currently.
But would it just naturally be something that a developer or a homeowner would be interested in building that would be profitable for them, but also create something that is just naturally affordable as well?
Yeah, that's definitely one. We've had folks that have come in and talked to us about, they've lived in an R1A district or they lived in a different district where, they might be limited on space because they have a detached garage in a house, and their lot's pretty small. Well, now if I can convert my basement or I can attach it to the house and I can still meet my lot coverage requirements, because there are still limitations. But yeah, a lot of them look at it as a secondary income. The same reason we have home occupation standards to allow you to operate a business out of your house, because it helps you generate additional income from probably the place where you're spending the most of your income is on your house. So it's something that allows our citizens to kind of build additional net worth and things out of just your home. But yes, by benefit of that, I know we talk about, seniors and aging seniors wanting to age in place. There are a lot of young folks moving to the city too that need affordable housing as well. So yeah, it provides that additional space. I went to a university that had, or no, it wouldn't be a subdivision, about a city square mile of homes that had ADUs behind it. And that's where the bulk of the college students lived, was in these granny flats behind people's homes. So to me, it was normal until I moved to the first city that I worked in, and there were none. I was like, oh, wow, what's this? So I think they do offer an additional level of affordability that we don't have a lot of right now.
I'll add to Brian, the question around does size have to do with affordability is because of some of the things that Brian spoke about. Well, we were actually requiring buildings to be bigger than they needed to be. We were unintentionally limiting the amount of affordable housing that could be built in the city. And so, when we were talking about missing middle housing, which traditionally is attached housing, townhouses, duplexes, those, if you look around town, often those are some of the most expensive homes, the big new duplexes that are going up. And it's because of some of those incentives around forcing them to be a certain size and having the bulk plan at a place where you get like the 3-level ones that are really big and expensive. By tweaking the bulk plan, by looking at those maximum or the required lot sizes and lot coverage, we're able to hopefully see not only buildings that fit the character of the neighborhood, but also just are fundamentally smaller, which allow them to be more affordable. And so some of those unintended consequences that were in the code for a long time is like a big part of what we were trying to address as well.
I'd add one more thing on that. The ADUs do, I think we'll see more get built now that they're, less requirements and they're allowed in more areas, but they're still rentals. You can't break off that ADU and sell it. And one of the Hugo's idea about the cottage, the backyard cottages and those kind of things where you could build something that's functionally equivalent to an ADU, but would have its own utility service and could be sold. That creates another level of naturally occurring affordable housing that has the ability for somebody to actually buy.
And it seems like that's done now on just the corner lots where you could do that back third. But
yes,
other than that, there's no real opportunity to sell an ADU or have a subdivision of a parcel.
No, not currently.
Is that a state law or a county law?
So it's more in how our code is set up. So corner lots, were the only one that we could identify that, well, it was what was adopted. But part of that discussion was looking at maybe in the future, how could ADUs be developed? It wasn't something that we got to with this step. Maybe later iterations of the code, but this is the level that we were able to get to up to now.
And so the next step up would be the courtyard scenario. So, full redevelopment of an interior lot into a.
Yeah, there's that option. It's limited in some areas because you have to provide that 1,500 square foot courtyard. So it would take an assembly of multiple lots in many cases. But we do have some parcels in the city that are much larger remnants of older buildings or older farms or things like that that have opportunities to develop in that manner.
How is the land ownership divided in a courtyard lot then if they own the courtyard property?
So they don't own, the courtyard property would have to be owned by an HOA. So it would be an HOA type product. Then everybody else would own their independent lots. So it'd be similar to a normal subdivision. Like, not necessarily what you'd see one in Inglewood, but in other parts of Denver that have like a park that's owned and operated and maintained by the HOA, where everybody else's lot is independently owned by each property owner.
So then the lots that the house sits on would be owned by the homeowner?
Yes.
Okay.
So like KB Home, they did a lot of that, their courtyard style, and it was set up that exact way that he's talking about, like, so, yeah.
It's very similar. You're just creating the shared common space there instead of like in the middle of a backyard between the front and the
Right.
back. So I think it's great that's allowed. I think that brings density. And it brings an ability to have for sale product of each of those individual units, which I think is what's the detriment to the ADUs and the incentive to build them for just a normal resident. They can't sell it.
Would there then be an opportunity for the city to own the land and then build like in a land trust model sort of situation where you could do a courtyard housing in the city on land that maybe Inglewood could buy and preserve in a land trust model? Does that make sense?
You mean like a part of a land banking system, like the city purchases the property and then
Yeah, and then
develops
you
it?
sell the homes to the homeowners, but you own the
Well,
land and.
What a great segue into this next part of the project. So the Code Next project kind of took on 3 phases. We had the housing policy discussion. We had the Code Next rewrite of Title 16. There's a third piece that was also a housing site assessment. So what we did, we worked with our consultants to assess city-owned property in Inglewood and in Sheridan for any kind of redevelopment projects that we could bring to this group. So you could actually have kind of a leg up on, some of the city-owned property. So we have 4. You'll see only 1 is located in Inglewood. 3 of them are in Sheridan around sorry, I'm changing the screen on my computer. Around the golf course. The first one, we have 2 vacant lots across from Emerson Park. They're zoned R1A, and the consultant proposed a 2 detached house development with an ADU for each one. The way it's drawn, they actually did the drawings for some of this prior to the adoption of Code Next. There was a time when there was a discussion of having 2 ADUs on lots of a certain size. So just understand that that's kind of where this one's coming from. Some of the concerns that this property has, one, because it's city-owned property in parkland, it would require a public vote for sale. The lots technically, or by code, are too small to develop as 2 single-family detached homes. So it would require some form of variance to get down there. And the biggest, other big issue is that there's some sewer infrastructure running through portions of this lot and potentially floodplain running through the lot. So the sewer infrastructure would require the city or the developer to move it because you can't build over it. So they would require you to move it, which would drive up the cost. Our second site is what's called I think this is the Southern Golf Course. It's adjacent to Broken T. It is in the city of Sheridan. And this lot and the next lot are both part of a plan unit development. So when Broken T was developed, we had to go in and zone the land for a plan unit development. So a very specific type of zoning to get the golf course use. The other thing that's very important to understand is that golf course, that there is some historic landfills in the area. I think the golf course is built on top of one. And so it would take a lot of mitigation work to be able to put housing on top of that land. So again, while we could rezone it, so the first step, the city would have to rezone it. So we'd have to go to public hearings in the city of Sheridan to rezone the property to get whatever land use we're trying to. In this case, our consultants drew it in as a 16-unit townhouse development or detached house project, using our requirements as the kind of the base for it. There's some additional infrastructure on site. I think there was some water treatment that was done on this site in the past. So all of that infrastructure again would have to be relocated, moved off-site or moved to portions of the site that we're not going to build on. And there's an existing IGA between the city of Inglewood and the city of Sheridan that would likely need to be amended to get this kind of project. The next one is in the northwest corner of Broken T Golf Course. This one, I think in the aerial, you can see it. It's right along one of the fairways. So, our consultant really took that into consideration. You don't necessarily want a house backing up to a golf course when you're going to get pinged with golf balls a lot. They designed this one as a 16-unit attached house product. So townhomes again, with a 2-story apartment building with 8 apartments. Again, very similar issues. We would need to rezone to a residential use. So out of the PUD for the golf course, it would require new subdivision plats. There's additional infrastructure here that would actually need to be extended. There's a traffic study that's likely going to be required because the street, I guess you can't see my mouse, Clay Street, the street that runs north and south next to this, is the traffic department at the city of Sheridan did not feel that it was designed to accommodate this additional traffic flow. So you'd have to do a traffic study to show that the existing traffic could be accommodated, or the existing and future traffic could be accommodated. And again, then we still have the suitability issues with being on top of a previous landfill, and the existing IGA between the city of Inglewood and Sheridan. It would have to be amended just in order to get this project going. And our last project site that we looked at is on the southeast corner at Oxford and River Point Parkway. This one is in a separate plan unit development. So this one is in the plan unit development for the River Point development. So if you're thinking like Target and all Costco, that area is part of that PUD. So again, it would require us to rezone or amend the existing PUD. The development is proposed at either a 6-story apartment building with 54 units, surface parked, or 2 6-story apartment buildings built as a podium. So that's parking on the first level, ground level, and apartments above. But again, there's actually some height concerns from the development team at the city of Sheridan. From what I could understand during the zoning case for that Costco and Target, there were some considerations made for people's views to be able to see the mountains and other areas, as well as just some ideas to limit the height of those buildings. I think it was to 35 feet. Yeah, 35 feet for aesthetic consideration, and soil contamination and compaction issues. So there's, again, a lot of issues with that site, kind of going back through, looking at it from a redevelopment standpoint. There's also limiting access to the site from both Quincy and from River Point. There's some driveway spacing issues that they would need to meet from their intersections. Your driveways have to be pushed back a certain number of feet. You don't necessarily want driveway access where people are trying to turn right and make additional traffic maneuvers at a stoplight. So again, and then landfill mitigation systems might be required. Suitability analysis would be required to locate residential property in a historic landfill area. So these were some of the projects that we didn't know all of the issues going in. We just knew some areas that where we own land. And so we start this analysis. We work with the city of Sheridan. We do analysis internally, as we would do for anybody else that brought in a new project for us. We sit down and look at it and say, what are the difficulties? You know, what's going to drive up cost? What's going to be much harder to develop than anything else. And so out of all four of the projects that we looked at, they're all four very difficult to develop. So we try to do our own analysis on property that we own. But if any future site, if, you know, the direction is to create a land banking program, the same thing would occur. You know, when you're starting to buy your property, we would do what a developer would do and conduct these meetings to try to figure out what are the issues going to be with redeveloping a site, what's going to drive up cost, how much density can we get, you know, to make that pencil out. Do what now? That could be another one that we look at. You know, they did some alternatives to many of them. I think they're all in your packet. The courtyard pattern was an alternative. I think the way that they designed it, the lot depth was not deep enough to get a lot of units. So they took a little bit of liberty and ran the courtyard through the middle. I think north to south instead of east to west. But it could definitely be something that we could always take a look at. The hard part about the courtyard pattern is you're still required to set your first building back 25 feet to keep that wall of front building lines across the block in order. And a lot that's that shallow, you may only get 2 units rather than the 6 or 5 that they showed on there. So there are some complexities with that one too. Yes, ma'am.
So the first 3 sites are in Sheridan, is that right? So
You might have to yell. I can barely hear
the
you.
first 3 sites we're looking at? Sorry, the last 3 are in Sheridan?
Yes, ma'am.
So would that be like a partnership with them? Are
So-
these like, I don't know how we discovered these lots if they're,
We own the
Englewood owns them?
property. The
Okay.
city owns the property, but it's in the city of Sheridan, so we would have to follow their jurisdiction and their rules.
okay. I get
I
it now.
think if it was like something along the Prop 123, they've indicated that they would like to partner in development like that, at least from a planning perspective. They've said that that would be beneficial for both of us, because those numbers can count towards both municipalities, at least the way that we understand it. Or it has the potential to.
Do you believe those sites to be ready for Prop 123, shovel ready, 10 years out? With all of the restrictions?
From a planning standpoint, I think all 4 of those sites are going to be very hard. Very, very difficult. I've never had to do any kind of mitigating studies for development in or around a landfill. So I don't know what all that entails. But I know that it's probably going to be really hard.
I worked with a condo property that was adjacent to a gas station with a buried tank, and the EPA studies, I think, took 7 to 10 years, somewhere in there, just for the soil studies before they could build on it. So that's why I was curious.
Brian, would the way these sites could be developed, would it be finding a developer who's willing to go through the process as as a partner in it? Is that the path if this is something to be pursued?
Do you want to answer that? I think that's kind of the idea is either the city is the developer. I think that's where we're just looking at it from a feasibility standpoint, not necessarily going down the road planning on someone being partners, but I think we're exploring the options of, could it be us? Could it be another developer?
Well, I think one of the things that, good evening, everybody, Brad Power, Community Development Director. One of the things I think that we would try to look at in this, in addition to all the issues with getting through Sheridan's development process, is I could virtually guarantee you that we would not be able to be in a position to do anything other than give the land to a developer to do this, to write down the cost, because Brian touched on some of the costs here. So the city's partnership in this would actually be a donator of the land in order to make it somewhat feasible to get the financial gap closed. I think if the council directed us, we would definitely probably put this in front of the development community to see what level of interest would be there, and at least have the conceptual conversations about who, if anybody, could find a way to make this feasible on the private side as a public-private partnership.
These are all greenfield or brownfield sites. Was there any look at reuse or redevelopment of underutilized city property?
No, not as part of this process.
So the idea behind land banking is different than a land trust, right? So you hold on to the land and then you encourage the development around the plot of land so that other developers pay for the infrastructure and the redevelopment of the land. Is there any opportunity for the land around these sites to be redeveloped separately by developers who would want to buy it and come in or be incentivized?
I think that would be a conversation we'd have to have with Sheridan, because obviously those are different owners and they would have their own motivations to work with that community to see if there's any additional ability. But if we started a trend on some of these properties, then the value changes on if there's marginal properties around it. Then the motivation for the private sector to express interest to Sheridan, to those property owners, might increase.
That was it for my presentation, so sorry.
No, that was excellent. That was excellent. Thank you. Excellent. Surely no more questions. Yes, no? Hugo, I saw that you were about to turn on your mic. Yeah, go for it.
It seems like the Emerson lots could be developed into something. That there could be some density you could make work there, especially at a low land cost to make work, even if there is sewer movement needed. The other ones bring up all kinds of other challenges. But the other ones are much denser, maybe more impactful sites if you could develop versus, adding 4 units or 6 units on Emerson.
Mm. That one does work. Yeah.
On the Emerson lot, in that area over there, that area is prone to flooding and it has to deal with the drainage over there. You could increase the size of the pipe, but there's nowhere to go.
Right.
Until Denver gets done doing all of their upgrades to their, water system and stuff. So I would say trying to build something there, you're prone to lawsuit and a half, no matter what you do. Or the city's gonna have to dump a ton of money into it in order to fix it. But still, there's no place for the water to go till Denver's done doing their thing.
Yeah, I think the area in that area, it's called Dry Gulch. There's some flooding issues in the area. So that was one of the other problematic things that I identified internally when we looked at it, was flooding, infrastructure relocation. Just from a construction standpoint, yeah, it'd be very difficult.
Jake?
Sorry, I think I probably missed this, but would these be, what exact kind of housing would these be? Would these be like deed restricted, owner occupied, or would these wouldn't be market rate, right?
the whole idea of putting city land, city-owned land on the table is to try to drive toward affordable units exclusively and not have it be balanced by market. And that's some of the challenge financially, is how do we close the gap? We want to have the affordable units, but we have a lot of infrastructure costs on some of these sites. So the idea is to try to maximize the affordability that we would have based on the investment that we would make in these outcomes.
Okay, thank you, Brian. I'm gonna, of course, correcting here, okay? Because that was such a great discussion and I'm glad that you all had incredible questions. It seems like this was enriching, yeah, to this process. So, Brian, slam dunk. Okay, so question for all of you. We're just gonna have a conversation as a group to kind of wrap up. And so I'm curious, like now that you have a little bit more understanding of what Brian just shared, you've got some context. Are there any incentives or product recommendations? I mean, you kind of have said them, right? Just now, like you've shared Emerson being like court cottages. Anything else come to mind that you want to?
I think the land banking option with the city of Sheridan partnership could be.
I like the concept that if there's not an ability to have, a cottage zoning where you can bifurcate and sell the lot, that if the lot is owned by a community land trust or the housing authority, it makes it very easy for them to build ADUs that could be rented and increase density versus somebody market rate doing it. Or figuring out incentives for somebody market rate, not dissimilar to the Summit County article that was shared to incentivize or a building of an ADU that would be rented.
It's something also to consider, like if we wanted something I would want out of this committee is if you wanted to recommend zoning change to our zoning code to allow for those backyard cottages, then that would give a little more flexibility on that Emerson lot and a lot of other lots potentially in the city. That's something I would be interested in hearing from the committee about.
I'm hearing a lot of variety of options though here, like, we've said this in previous discussions, like it's not one solution. And so everything from lot configuration to ADU, parking reduction, changing requirements, zoning. There's a lot of options here. Okay. Yes.
What I mentioned a minute ago about if this is the extent of the undeveloped land owned by the city, I would certainly want to look at something, what the city owns that could be a candidate for adaptive reuse or redevelopment.
Is it possible for another meeting or for just a request to understand more of the land that's owned by the city that would fit in that bucket? Like similar, like it's really cool to see these 4 really hard to develop sites.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Brad.
Well, we happen to be sitting on one right now, which is City Center, which is probably the highest leverageable site that the city controls. And our former developer, and we're endeavoring to find a replacement, was going to have approximately 1,200 housing units in the plan. Now we got to the point where about 10% of that was going to be affordable. The question now is can we leverage that even more in the next round? So City Center is definitely an optimal site, but there's other sites that are configured now, like in parking lots in the downtown area that the city owns. We'd obviously have to replicate that parking so that we can provide the sustainability for our small business community up and down Broadway. But those are leverageable as real estate if we can figure out the way to narrow the cost. And those are all still possibilities for the future.
Okay. Anything else? Right, I'm just trying to get us out of here on time and on schedule. And so what I'd love for you to do, just gonna pass these down, I should have done this sooner. But if you could just take a Post-it and pass it down, one of each color. And just write your, I like, I wish, you don't have to do it, Brian. I like, I wish, I wonder. So what you liked about today's session, or what you learned, what you wish for this process, and what you wonder, kind of like Hugo's point. I wonder if we could have another meeting to go deeper in this conversation. So take about 5 minutes. Not 15. Once you're done, just follow Hugo's lead and place them on the I like, I wish, I wonder chart paper. Here it is. So we've been making some steady progress over these past 6 months, just collecting a lot of information. So the education has been rich. And, you know, for June, we'll get more into inclusionary zoning. July 11th, we'll have some regionalization and public-private partnership, and coinciding with some more brainstorming. But something that I think I want you all to recognize and give yourself credit for is like how you've had this opportunity to like kind of brainstorm and think together about these big ideas, like what you want your recommendations, and having some heated exchange, some peaceful exchange, what have you, but it's okay that your ideas aren't always in alignment. The plan is to get you working toward that. But before we get there, I think it would be really great if you'll see that we've got these QR codes. And so it's a form with about 5 questions that we want you, and I can pass some around so you can just do it from where you're sitting. They're all over. But the idea is we want you in your own voice to be able to, answer some of these questions around how you personally believe we can start recommending. You can start recommending. Just trying to figure out whichever's easier. You can stand, it's beside you. Does everyone have what they need? Okay. But what I really want to be able to capture is your own individual thoughts about what you want to recommend, how you prioritize, and in this way, we'll be able to capture in depth in your words, like where you sit, what you believe, what you've learned, and how you'd like to bring some recommendations forward. And then we'll take that and when we meet again in June and forward, we'll be able to really start working from what you share in detail. So please be sure to have, it's 5 questions. Please be sure to have those completed by 5 p.m. tomorrow. Okay. And then on June 6th, this is where my colleague Glenna Norval and I will meet with you together. So you'll get an introduction to Glenna. We're going to you're going to hear about inclusionary zoning, but also we're going to start setting the stage for what that process with Glenna is going to be like as you start looking at how you're going to prioritize some of these recommendations. Okay. Any questions? Okay. Please answer those 5 questions by 5 p.m. tomorrow. I would appreciate it so much. And I appreciate you. Thank you for your time today. Yeah, great job. And Brian, you were outstanding. Yeah, thank you. All right.